She entered the palace only to tend the garden, but awakened in the prince a love that blossomed. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. She arrived before the bell for prime when the palace slept without admitting it. Frost webbed the lower leaves and traced the gravel with a fragile lace that would melt at the first real breath of day. Elodie could see her own breath, could see how it shook on the exhale, then steadied as she dipped her hand into the basket for twine. She was small among the hedges, a figure meant to disappear. Monsieur Vauclair had told her so the day before, with a mouth that pinched shut at each end. You walk in lines, he had said. You keep your face down. If you must be heard, you whisper. If you must be seen, you are seen at dawn. She had nodded. Not because she agreed, but because agreement was the only door that opened. Now she went to the north rose parterres, which had been let go through the worst of the winter. The canes were long and soft at the tips, the old wood crowded with blind shoots, the kind that looked like promise but delivered nothing. She touched each cane as she had been taught by a gardener who had never stepped within a mile of a palace gate. The art did not change with the address. You cut back to where the wood is alive. You read the plant the way you read a face. You do not apologize for helping something become what it is meant to be. Her fingers had no gloves. She could not afford them, and did not like them anyway. She pinched twig from cane and felt the tiny answer of sap still sleeping. She found a node angled outward, waited for the first light to show her the color of healthy wood, then made the cut cleanly. The sound was like a syllable clipped from an argument. She bound a loose graft with a strip of cloth torn from an old apron. She told the rose what she would do next, not with words anyone else could hear, but with the patience you give a child learning to walk. It would be enough. A lark startled from a hedge, scattered a handful of notes above her head, then settled again. The sound steadied her more than prayer. She had said hers on the walk from the servants' entrance, the kind that does not make you holier, only braver for the next hour. On her second plant, while she weighed whether to cut another inch from a cane that insisted on pointing inward, she felt a change in the air. It was not wind. It was attention. She did not look up right away. Looking up without invitation could cost a place like this more quickly than any mistake of craft. Why do you cut living wood? The question was asked as if it had wandered out by itself and would blush to be noticed. It was a man's voice, steady, puzzled, but polite. She looked up then. A gentleman stood at the edge of the path in a coat that did nothing so common as glitter. It simply fit him so well it might have been sewn by silence. He had one hand half inside a glove, as if he had been distracted while putting it on and forgotten. Protocol she did not know crowded her shoulders anyway. She lowered her head and said, "Because it must be guided to bloom stronger, Highness." She had not practiced how to say, Highness. It found its own space between her tongue and her teeth, and came out without stumbling. She dared to meet his eyes for the length of a breath. He did not look offended. He looked alive. The look leaned toward the rose, not toward her, and still it burned the edges of her fear to ash. And not every eye sees it as living, she added, quieter. Some wood green to the sight is tired to the heart. He smiled then. It was not the smile she had seen painted on faces in tapestries. It had no pose. It broke over his mouth like a sudden breeze that cannot be stopped or shamed. He moved closer, each step acknowledging that this was her patch of earth at the moment, and he was stepping into it. His gaze was on her hands. "May I?" He held out his gloved hand as if to ask for the shears. She felt her body go still. No one had ever asked the hands for tools in this place. She looked to the path again. No one blocked it. No one coughed to remind her that she was a servant and he was a prince. She placed the shears in his palm. His wrist flexed. The glove creaked softly. He held the tool awkwardly for a moment, then passed it back with a small laugh directed at himself. "You will have to tell me where to cut," he said. "I am, I confess, no surgeon." Her mouth almost smiled. She kept it from showing. She touched the cane she had considered. "Here, on the outward eye. See how the wood is whiter on the slice just above the node? It will throw a bud to the light." He leaned closer. He peered, and the fair sunlight not yet risen from the horizon slid along his profile. He was not handsome the way tales insist princes must be. He was something less polished and more certain. When he straightened, he looked from the cut to her face. Do roses resent being trimmed, do you think? She had never been asked to imagine the feelings of roses for comfort. She considered. They do not call it trimming, they call it readiness. His eyes warmed. He put a finger gently below the cut, as if to reassure a child before a needle. Then he stepped back. Thank you, mademoiselle. She bowed with care to keep the basket from sliding off her wrist. He did not wait for an answer. Courtly footsteps sounded from the distance, then were swallowed by hedges. He left the north beds quietly, as if stepping away from a question he meant to keep. After he was gone, the world returned to its rhythm. The frost surrendered to the shy lifting of the sun. The lark offered another piece of song, and then was coy with itself, silent again. Elodie breathed, then fixed the next cane and the next, making choices that would not be seen by anyone but her come noon. It was better like that. Flowers kept their own calendar, indifferent to clapping. Still, the moment had put a warm stone into the pocket of her morning. It burned there without hurting. She worked faster, because speed felt like safety. She moved with the economy of someone counting hours and coins both, one for rent, one for bread, one for the basket of seed she would buy for herself when spring allowed her to grow something not owned by a king. She had finished half the row by the time the sun cleared the roof lines of the eastern wing. A shadow fell across the gravel, thin and elegant, like script written on air. Madame de Montreuil passed along the colonnade, with a small flock of ladies trailing like obedient birds. She did not stop. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her gaze, even in passing, weighed Elodie from crown to heel, found no aristocratic charter written on her, and kept the scale anyway. Elodie's shoulders remembered to narrow. She kept her eyes on her work. The ladies' perfumes left behind a sweetness that did not belong to flowers. It belonged to rooms where doors were closed long enough for air to learn a single name. Stronger, said Monsieur Vauclair's voice later, not asking. He appeared after the women had disappeared. You drew attention. She had not called it drawing. She had called it surviving. Still, she put the shears into the basket and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. I answered when spoken to, she said. His fingers fussed with the tassel of his waistcoat. His eyes flicked past her shoulder toward the hedges, calculating where a pair of eyes might still be hidden. He was not unkind, but he was cautious to his marrow, and that made him hard in public. You will stay to the outer beds until I say otherwise. Latrines and border edges. The court forgets to look there. Let it forget you. She bowed her head, not from agreement, but because arguing in daylight burned your skin without warming you. When he left with a sigh that made his coat lift slightly and settle. She did not hold that against him. In his way, he had kept her in work. She meant to keep herself in dignity. Afternoon slid into the garden, thin and pale. She drank water from a cup that had belonged to her mother and kept working. The north beds would not be more beautiful for knowing who had touched them. They would simply be better, and that was the only kind of beauty she trusted. The next morning began the same. She walked through the servants' passage, nodding to Colette, a kitchen girl with flour on her cheek and eyes too eager for such a young face. Colette pressed a roll into Elodie's hand without ceremony and whispered, "Eat before the geese eat you." Elodie hid the bread in her pocket for the work break that might not come, then stepped out toward the garden as the sky learned the color of day. She moved with the memory of yesterday, like a careful weight balanced on her head. She had not dreamed of it, because she was too tired to dream. She had only slept with a sore back, and woken with a sore back, and taken both as signs of life. At the north beds, the frost gave way earlier than before. She bent to the first rows and found where the wood insisted on its own strong angle. She made the cut and tied the binding, and told herself the world would not repeat itself on command. It did not repeat in exactly the same way. The prince came as if he had gone out for a walk, and discovered himself at the roses without meaning to. His steps were direct. He had left behind the flock of attendants who made the world louder by their silence. He carried a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil, whose tip betrayed its use. He stopped 3 paces from where she worked, and waited until the sound of her shears paused. "Good morning," he said, as if it were a private invention between them. She turned. "Highness? Do you suppose," he asked, "that I might impose upon you with a question or two?" About the roses, I mean. I find myself subject to a sudden education. Her mouth softened with humor that she was not reckless enough to show fully. Ask, she said. He looked at his notebook as if words on it might accuse him. He closed it, then opened it again. If one wishes a floriferous season, he read, what is the proper balance between nitrogen and patience? She could not help that the first sound from her throat was a laugh. She caught it and made it smaller. Patience is the larger portion, Highness. Nitrogen is for leaves. Flowers are paid for with time and good cuts. He listened like a man who wanted to become his own better self. He asked about soil that clung and soil that drained. He asked about grafts that failed. He asked what to do with a cane that threw too many flowers at once and left itself tired. She told him the truth of things without ornament. He wrote down her plain answers as if they were a new kind of statecraft. He took a step closer to watch her hands steady a graft that had shifted in the night. He forgot for a heartbeat that his own hand was gloved. He set his palm on the stone, edging to lean in, and the glove caught on a rough corner. He removed it, not ceremoniously, simply, the way a man removes a hat to see better. He bent, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the air held it like a secret. Consistency, he said, as if trying the word in his own mouth. I am told I have the gift for grand gestures. Consistency has not been named as one of my strengths. Roses do not admire fireworks, she said, before she could remind herself not to be quick. The word left, and there it was, between them. She saw surprise flicker, and then fade into something gentler. No, he said, I suppose they do not. She felt the blush rise in her cheeks, and was grateful for the cold that might excuse it. She returned to the work, not to hide, but to remind herself who she was. He watched her bind a cane and cut another. When the binding needed a second pair of hands, he put his bare palm to the cane with a care that made her throat ache. There, she said. Hold to the outward. Yes. Like that. He held it exactly as she asked. His hand was warm. Hers was steady. Between them, the cane learned where to go and agreed. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement at the end of the walkway. An attendant in plain livery lingered, pretending to examine a ewe. The prince saw him too and did not change his posture. He took the notebook from his pocket, made a note that might have been nonsense, then closed it with decisive care. You have been generous, he said, straightening. I have not thanked you properly. You thanked me by listening, she said, then wished she had said nothing at all because the words were too naked for a place built of costumes. He did not seem to mind their lack of tailoring. He inclined his head. He put his glove into his right hand and his notebook into his left. He took one step backward to leave whatever small space etiquette might require, then turned. His first step on the gravel made a sound like small shells shifting. He did not hurry. He moved with a certainty that made everything else in the path align itself to let him through. Elodie returned to her work. She breathed in, breathed out, and the world steadied. She found the next cane and measured her cut with her eye and then with her finger. Behind the hedges, the palace exhaled 1,000 instructions that made no difference to soil. She let them pass like rain at a distance. The hours thinned into minutes when she worked. She forgot, for a blessed stretch, that the prince had stood where she stood. She forgot not because it was unimportant, but because the plant in her hand demanded the kind of attention that leaves no room for memory until the job is done. She trimmed out dead wood that had hidden under a mask of lichen. She removed an inward-facing bud that would only crowd leaves and invite mildew. She loosened earth around the base of a plant that had settled too deep. She made a small trench to carry water where it would be wanted. The lark returned and sang. It gave 2 notes, then 3, and was silent again, as if it accepted no commission to please anyone's day beyond its own. Elodie smiled at that, and did not tilt her head to find it. Some things performed better without an audience. The morning stretched its legs toward noon. She paused then to eat the crust Colette had handed her. She broke it into pieces small enough to swallow without attracting attention, and washed them down with a swallow of water. She did not sit. Sitting marked you as idle. Standing marked you as necessary even when you were not wanted. A wet scent rose from the soil as the frost finally gave up. She swallowed the last bit of bread and returned to the row. The cut she had made at dawn was oozing a small drop of sap that caught the light like a pearl. She touched the rim of the cut with a clean cloth, not to stanch it, but to keep bugs from sticking in it. She hummed one line of a tune she remembered her mother using when she kneaded dough. It was not the tune that mattered. It was the rhythm. Plants liked what repeated without violence. Her thoughts, while she worked, trod a path she had never dared to draw with ink. A prince had asked her a question and waited for her answer. The sentence looked foolish when she put it that way. She refused to speak it in her head for long. She took it apart like a knot and set the string aside. Better to tie it to something useful later. Movement again. This time it came with the first hint of the day's warmth. Elodie did not look up. She was binding a cane and needed to keep the pressure even. She wound the twine, pinched, tied, and released, without jarring the wood. Only then did she glance along the path. It was empty. She felt foolish for a moment, and then relieved by the ordinariness of gravel without shoes on it. She pulled her basket a pace farther with her foot so it would follow her along the row. The weave rasped softly against the stones. She reached for another length of twine and found her fingers closing on smooth leather instead. She frowned and looked down. A glove lay half in her basket, half on the path, its kid skin creased from recent use. It was too fine for any gardener. It was not Vauclair's. He wore brown gloves that had seen a decade of winters. This one was pale and still smelled faintly of something that tried to disguise itself as citrus. Her breath stopped as if she had walked into a low branch. He had left it when he had adjusted the notebook and the shears, perhaps, or when his glove had caught on the stone, and he had removed it and then forgotten. Forgetting a glove in a garden was a small sin. Forgetting it on a path where Madame de Montreuil's eye could make it into a story was a danger. She looked up sharply. The path to the left curved toward the orangerie. The path to the right led to a set of steps where footmen sometimes stood in pairs. No one was in immediate sight. She did not trust that. The garden made spies out of shadows and good intentions. She wiped her hand quickly on her skirt, not to clean it, but to make sure there was no moisture to stain the leather, then bent her head and reached for the glove with a movement so small it might not disturb even the air around it. She was still a hand's width from the pale leather when crisp footsteps sounded on the gravel behind her. She did not rise at the first sound of the footsteps. Her instinct was to finish the motion she had begun. The glove would be lifted and tucked into her basket. Later, out of sight, she would find a way to return it. Later was safer here. Later had walls. A shadow fell over the glove before her fingers touched it. She kept her hand still in the posture of a servant who had been caught. Two small shoes appeared at the edge of her vision, silk and sharp. She raised her head slowly because quickness read as guilt. Madame de Montreuil regarded her as one might regard an unexpected insect found under a linen napkin. Her expression was not disgust. It was curiosity stretched thin over disdain. Behind her, two ladies hovered with expressions arranged to receive a lesson. "What have we here?" said Madame, light and almost musical. "Lost property, and a gardener with charitable hands. These gardens do breed such surprises." Elodie kept her eyes lowered without closing them. She could see the glove clearly. She could see the seal stamped in the leather at the cuff. She could see how it would sit inside a story if someone chose to place it there. She pitched her voice to the level of a corridor whisper. "A glove, madame. I meant to return it to the attendant post." "Of course," Madame said, and smiled as one smiles at a child who has reached for a treat before being invited. "How you intend devotion. Such zeal. One must always place things in their proper place, mustn't one? Ladies, observe. The order of objects keeps the order of a court." She bent without bending, a trick perfected with practice, and plucked the glove between thumb and forefinger. She held it away from her skirt as if it had acquired more garden than glove. The two ladies made small sounds of appreciation for the gesture, which was nothing and everything at once. "One does not carry a prince's glove in a basket for cabbages," Madame continued pleasantly. "Even if the basket belongs to roses for a morning, one entrusts it to the proper hand. I shall relieve you of the burden of duty, child." Elodie kept her face still. It cost her. The word child was not meant as kindness. It was meant as a wall. She bowed her head a fraction and stepped back the width of a leaf. Madame's eyes did not miss the movement. They saw everything and honored nothing but their own satisfaction. "Tell me your name," she said, as if they had not both decided Elodie did not need one. "Elodie, madame." Where are you from, Elodie? From Saint-Cloud, madame. How far one can travel on a single pair of shoes, madame mused. She turned the glove over, as if it might confess the path by which it had been lost. And you have family here? No, madame. No. How efficient. Well then, we must be careful with what we collect when we have no one to share the weight. Do you understand me? Yes, madame. Good. Now listen very carefully. You are to keep to the latrine borders today. There has been a lapse in their care. One would not wish any unpleasantness to linger, would one? It will keep you out of our way. Madame had no authority over the gardener's tasks. That belonged to Vauclair. But authority in Versailles did not always travel with title. It travelled with gaze. Elodie nodded once to show that she understood where to be invisible. Madame's smile widened by the width of a pin. You see, she said, more to the ladies than to Elodie, how the world arranges itself when spoken to correctly. She floated away, the glove a pale fish in her hand. The ladies followed, whispering behind their fans. Their murmurs slid along the hedges like a breeze that did not lift any leaves. Elodie remained where she was until the sound of their shoes had died. She lifted her basket and moved toward the borders without waiting for Vauclair to assign her there. Better to cede ground than to appear to defend it. When she reached the low beds edging the walk near the small privies that served those who never admitted needing them, she knelt and began to clear old leaves and bind the low plants into modest order. By mid-morning, the orangerie inspection gathered itself like a slow storm. The king was not present. One did not need him for a pageant. There were ministers, there were ladies, there were staff in their best livery. The great pots rolled out under careful supervision to show that the winter had not claimed a single tree. Monsieur Vauclair smoothed his coat again and again, as if he could press nerves into a flatter shape. "Stay where you are," he said to Elodie when he passed. His voice was low and hurried. He had not chosen this moment and could not outmaneuver it. He was the sort of man whose power increased when no one was watching him. Now he was seen and therefore compromised. Elodie kept her hands moving. She uprooted a weed that grew with the boldness of someone convinced it had no enemy. She placed it in the basket. She smoothed soil. She reminded herself that the world she could control was measured in inches, not halls. Then his shadow fell across her hands. She did not have to look up to know it. The air changed for him, the way a lake smooths under a lull. She rose carefully, once again balancing humility against dignity. "Highness," she said. He glanced at the border with a faint frown, then at the north beds. For an instant irritation crossed his face, as if some equation had yielded the wrong sum. He folded it away and addressed her in a tone that carried enough for the nearest onlookers to hear without calling attention. "I saw the graft in the third row," he said, "the one with the torn binding. It lives because someone refused to give up on it. Thank you." He meant to leave then, with the statement placed like a neat stone on a table. But Vauclair arrived in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He bowed to the prince. He bowed too deeply to be natural. The depth was a confession. He had organized neither the scene nor the narrative, but meant to claim both. "Highness," he said smoothly, "the young woman is assigned today to the borders. There was neglect I must correct. The north beds shall be tended by a senior hand. Until they are ready to be seen, it will prevent confusion." He did not look at Elodie when he said it. He looked at the prince and at the orangerie steps where courtiers had begun to gather. The word neglect was a rope. He tossed it as if it were a lifeline. The prince's gaze moved from Vauclair to Elodie and back again. There was a pause in which the air took a breath. Then he inclined his head. "As you arrange, Vauclair. The health of the garden is your care." Vauclair bowed again, both relieved and diminished. He had secured his small victory in public. It would cost him in private ways later. He did not know that yet. He gestured to Elodie without looking at her. The gesture said, "Keep your place." She kept it. The inspection passed in measured steps and speeches. Names were named. Praise was distributed with the careful inequality of inherited power. The orangerie was admired for being exactly as it had been. This was counted as triumph, because winter had wished otherwise. The courtiers, who did not spend their days with soil under their nails, found this deeply moving. As the party dispersed down the walk, a pair of gentlemen drifted near where Elodie knelt, neither close enough to be known for talking to her, nor far enough to be innocent of listening. They say he likes the early air now, one murmured. They say he likes the gardener who breathes it, the other replied softly. Why else come to the north beds at dawn? Ridiculous, said the first, delighted. A prince and a peasant and a pot of roses walk into a chapel. It is a farce poorly told. Yet the glances were seen. Seen and embellished, the second said. It takes very little for a poor story to grow. One merely adds water. They moved on. Their laughter was not cruel. It was the laughter of men who believed themselves immune to consequence. By noon, what had begun as a murmur had flowered into a low chorus. The servants, who saw more than anyone supposed, kept their counsel. The ladies and gentlemen, who saw less than they boasted, adorned their ignorance with certainty. A phrase emerged and took root. The Rose Girl. Colette found Élodie at the borders and knelt with a bucket of fresh water balanced against her hip. Her eyes were big with news and loyalty fighting in them. Do not look up, Colette whispered. They are looking. They talk as if their mouths were borrowed. Are you well? I am working, Élodie said, and took the ladle Colette offered. She drank and handed it back. You are kind. Kindness is cheap when it is only a drink of water, Colette said fiercely, then clapped a hand over her mouth, aghast at her own boldness. Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive, Élodie said. Tell me how your dough is today. Colette blinked and almost smiled. It rose like a saint. If saints were sticky and needed flour, then your bread will forgive your insult, Élodie said. Go. They will miss you. Colette went reluctant. Élodie resumed her rhythm. She kept to the low beds. She kept to the edges. She made the small places better. It was the only reply she had. In the early afternoon, Chancellor Devereux appeared as if the day had summoned him. He moved with an economy that made people notice him only when he wished. He had a face that looked like a ledger closed at the end of a profitable month. He placed himself near the prince with a bow that was perfectly measured. Highness, he said gently, as one places a hand on a shoulder before giving unwelcome advice. A moment of counsel. The prince stepped aside with him to a slice of shade that did not fully hide them. The choice was deliberate. Privacy without secrecy. Devereux approved. There is a rumor, Devereux said. It grows as such things do, fed by nothing and thriving on air. It serves no one. It will serve the wrong ones if allowed to climb. Permit me to prune it. The prince's jaw tightened at the word prune. He glanced toward the north beds. His eyes found Élodie's bent shoulders by the borders. He returned his gaze to Devereux. Speak plainly, Chancellor. There is talk of attentions paid to a gardener, Devereux said. Talk is a small animal until it learns to bite. It will bite at the crown by evening if we do not tame it. The simplest way is to remove the object from the path. Dismiss the young woman, quietly, with a purse perhaps. No admission of anything, only a change of staff. Let winter be blamed and spring applauded for improvement. The prince's hands went to his sides and stilled there. His voice, when he answered, was still polite. It had a new thread in it, something that did not bend. She is the best pair of hands on the north beds, he said. Your counsel speaks of objects and paths. I speak of work. The roses require her. I require the roses. Do you advise me to make the gardens worse in order to make the court still? I advise your highness to preserve the greater good, Devereux said. A court is a living thing. It does not tolerate irregularities. It makes them into fables. Fables do not hold a crown, they break it. You speak as if the truth were an irregularity, the prince said softly. I speak as a man who must think how anything looks when seen by eyes that do not wish to understand, Devereux said. You may resist now and pay later, or you may accept the small pain and prevent a larger wound. Duty is cruel in this way. The prince looked toward the orangerie, where the last of the inspection party lingered like scent, stronger than the flower that left it. He considered. He was a man trained to consider. He nodded once in acknowledgement of the habit that had been bred into him, then surprised himself by not obeying it. No, he said. Not today. She will remain. The garden's answer to me. Devereux did not blink. He inclined his head as one bows to a mule that will not be moved. As your highness wishes, I will note your preference. He stepped back. It was not surrender. It was repositioning. By late afternoon, the smaller courtesies turned into smaller cruelties. A young gentleman with a new coat and old debts sauntered along the path that ran just behind the north beds. His companion, eager to be known as clever, plucked at a cane with a gloved hand. "Careful," said the first. "You will prick yourself and bleed scent of common rose. It does not go with your trim." "I wish to see why the gardener fusses so," said the second. "It is only a bush that stabs." He hooked a finger behind a thorn and dragged it down as if ringing a bell. The thorn caught and tore. The movement tugged the nearest cane, which snagged Elodie's sleeve where it had been mended twice already. The cloth gave with a sound that felt louder than it was. The rip opened along her forearm. Her skin showed pale in the sudden air. "Oh," cried the second, delighted and contrite in a single note. "Damage." How awkward. The handful of watchers who had floated near made small laughs. Not cruel, not kind. The sound of people enjoying that life had shaken itself and lost a button. Elodie did not look at them. She drew back her arm with a calm motion and examined the tear. It was clean. She took needle and thread from the small case in her basket and set to work with a competence that made the laughers look foolish to anyone inclined to notice. While she stitched, she spoke to the cane in the same tone she used for coaxing wayward shoots. "No harm done," she said. "You did as you are meant to do. We will make the line smooth again." She tied off the thread, bit it between her teeth, smoothed the cloth down, and returned to binding the cane. She did not look up even when the sound of the prince's step paused at the edge of the bed. He had seen everything. His face held itself in the shape required by a day filled with eyes. Only his hands betrayed him. They closed and opened once, as if remembering a promise to themselves. Monsieur Vauclair hovered in the background, torn. To defend her would be to set himself against a current. To say nothing would be to set himself against himself. He chose a middle course that satisfied no one and preserved his position. "Mind the canes, gentlemen," he called in a tone meant to be a jest among equals. "They bite hands that do not belong." The young men laughed. Of course. They moved on. The damage was done and mended, which is to say the damage remained in the memory of more people than the mending did. The sun slipped down and made the long glass windows of the orangerie burn like captured day. Servants began to move with the quiet haste of people who know that the day's last tasks must be done before the evening bell frees them for the pleasures they can afford. Elodie finished the row she had promised herself she would finish. She cleaned her shears. She counted her lengths of twine to know how much she would need tomorrow. She checked the knots along the binding of the third cane again, because the gesture calmed her. She was lifting her basket when she sensed Vauclair before she saw him. He approached with the tread of a man walking into a confession. He had shed some of his stiff pride with the day's heat. He looked tired and smaller. "You will come to the office," he said without preface. She followed him through the narrow door that smelled of old tobacco and damp paper. The room held the garden's secret spine. Plans rolled like scrolls, a wall of years marked by the plantings they had allowed. Vauclair did not sit. He stood behind the small desk and touched the surface with his forefinger, as if counting the wood grain. "He is displeased," Vauclair said quietly. "Which he?" Elodie asked before she could stop herself. "All of them," Vauclair said, with a dry attempt at humor that shriveled as soon as it felt air. "The ones who matter today. The ones who will matter tomorrow. You are called trouble because you are not invisible." "I did not ask to be seen," she said. "Which is what makes it worse," Vauclair answered. "It suggests you might be genuine. They prefer their disruptions intentional. It is easier to punish ambition than accident." "I have ambition," she said simply, "for roses." A muscle jumped in Vauclair's cheek. He closed his eyes for a breath and opened them. He looked past her shoulder at a place where he could see himself in the glass of a framed plan without being obvious about it. "You will keep to the borders until I say," he said. "You will not be where he is. You will not be where they are. If you are asked a question, you will answer it with as few words as you can remove from the truth. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said, because the words were what she would do anyway. He nodded. His eyes softened. He almost said something else, something not sanctioned by his position. He did not. He stood straighter. He reached for a paper on the desk, as if to busy his hands. The paper was blank. A cough at the door made them both turn. Chancellor Devereux stood there as if the wood had carved an opening in deference to him. He did not step inside. He did not need to. His presence filled the room like a new law. Monsieur Vauclair, he said, his tone civil to the point of chill. I require a signature. Vauclair's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. Of course, Chancellor. For what? For order, Devereux said mildly. He withdrew a folded document from a leather case and opened it with tidy care. The wax seal had already been broken and then pressed again with the same signet, a neat trick of bureaucracy. He placed the paper on the desk and smoothed it with his palm. Elodie did not move. She felt the way a plant feels when a shadow falls at noon. Her body knew and stood still anyway. Devereux looked at her with the faintest suggestion of a smile. It did not reach his eyes. It did not intend to. The royal household has determined, he said in a voice that would have sounded gentle, if not for its content, that the staffing roster requires adjustment to prevent further misinterpretations, to avoid burdens upon delicate sensibilities. Efficiency is our common aim, Vauclair swallowed. His voice emerged rough around the edges. Chancellor, I should like to be consulted upon any change to my— You are being consulted, Devereux said pleasantly, in the most efficient manner. Your signature acknowledges receipt. Your compliance is assumed, given the wisdom of the measure. He tapped the document with a finger. Vauclair glanced down. The words lifted from the page like nettles. Dismissal. Immediate. With a stipend to discourage complaint. No reason given, because reasons admitted guilt, and guilt was a resource they did not wish to spend. Elodie's breath remained even. She was surprised to find it so. She expected it to trip. It did not. She had known the shape of this long before the paper had found its way into the room. She had known it when Madame held the glove. She had known it when the laughter at her torn sleeve sounded like bells rung too fast. The prince, Vauclair began, and stopped. Devereux's glance warned him not to put the air between himself and a blow. The prince will be informed, Devereux said, as he ought, as we all will be. But the matter is the household's. We keep order so that he may keep the nation. Each man tends his garden. He slid the paper toward Vauclair. The gesture was courteous. It felt like the laying down of a blade. Vauclair's hand shook. He hid it by making a show of adjusting the paper. He reached for a pen. He hesitated. He stared at the portion where the blank line waited for his name to make this a fact that could not be argued. Devereux did not press. He waited, a man with all the time in the world and all the plans for it already drawn. The clock in the corridor struck the half-hour. The sound moved through the wood and into their bones. Somewhere outside, a lark gave one indifferent note. Inside, Vauclair put pen to paper and made the mark that would send Elodie from the palace before sunset. Devereux folded the document, sealing the decision with the smoothness of habit. He looked at Elodie not unkindly, as one might look at a chair one intends to remove from a room. You will leave by the servants' gate, he said. Your stipend will be provided at the quartermaster's. There is no stigma attached to this change. Tell yourself so, and others may believe it. If you are wise, you will not loiter for goodbyes. He inclined his head by the width of a coin and turned to go. On the threshold he paused as if remembering an afterthought and spoke without looking back. The order is effective at once. Elodie did not realize she had moved until she found herself outside the office with the papers silent still in her ears. The corridor smelled of wax and the faint vinegar tang of yesterday's cleaning. She touched the wall to feel the chill of stone and made herself breathe evenly. The word at once had already passed. She was late for her own leaving. She went nowhere for a moment because there were too many directions. The garden pulled one way. The servants' gate pulled another. The tiny dormitory room where her basket and her spare dress sat, folded like small animals waiting, pulled a third. She chose the only path that made sense to her body. She turned toward daylight. Colette found her before Elodie found the open air. The girl appeared as if she had been listening under the floor and had run ahead of the news. Flour dusted her sleeve. Her eyes were round as coins and much more honest. You cannot go to the gate, Colette whispered without preamble. Devereux will send a man to make sure you leave. If you go now, they will not let you touch even a leaf. You must decide whether you will be broken today or tomorrow. I prefer not to be broken at all, Elodie said, and managed a smile that was not a lie. How do you come by so much information for someone whose kingdom is dough? The kitchens hear everything, Colette said. The pans never talk, but the people who hold them have ears. You must leave by sunset, the quartermaster says. He has your stipend ready. He told me so because I asked him for my own bread tally, and he is a romantic. He thinks he understands love. Elodie blinked. The word landed lightly and then burrowed. She did not take it up. She set it aside where it could not burn her hands. I will not go to the gate, she said. Not yet. I will finish the rose arch at the bend. It is wrong to leave a living thing half-led. Colette grabbed her hand, then released it at once because hands did not hold hands in hallways. Finish it quickly, she breathed. I will watch the corridor and cough if anyone comes. If I cough like a goose, it is a lady. If I cough like a donkey, it is a man. If I cough like I am dying, it is the Chancellor. Go. You are a saint, Elodie said. I am sticky with sugar and sin, Colette said, and fled before the grin on her face turned into tears. The garden welcomed her with the indifferent mercy of a place that had no agenda beyond growth. The sky was a tempered grey that made colours look clean. The arch sat midway along the path, two half-crescents of cane rising from either side, waiting to be tied into a promise. She had planned its line in her head for weeks, stealing glances between tasks, thinking about the strength and the give of each cane. She took her twine and her knife and her patience, and set to work. She did not glance over her shoulder when footsteps sounded far off. She did not look toward the palace when a bell marked the hour with a clang that startled a bird from a low pine. She allowed her body to remember how to pull a cane toward the arch and hold it just long enough to tie. She placed soft cloth where the twine would bite if left bare. She spoke to the green wood as if it could understand restraint. There you are, she said. Not so tight. You need room to swell and not strain. Yes, bend. Now wait. Time thinned in the good way. She forgot that she was leaving. She forgot her small bed and the folded dress, the basket of seeds she had meant to buy in a month when the market would sell them for less. She remembered only the work. In work she did not need permission to exist. A shadow intersected her path. She felt it before she saw it and did not start. She finished the knot and then looked up. Prince Louis stood with his hat in his hand, as one might stop at a chapel door and remember to uncover. He had come quickly. His breath lifted the hair at his temple. His eyes went to the arch, then to her face, then back to the arch, a double devotion. I have been told a thing I do not accept, he said. I have been told a thing I intend to ignore until sunset, she said. He took a breath that might have been a laugh and was not. He stepped closer. Who told you? The paper told me with the Chancellor's voice, she said. I am to be gone as soon as I can make myself small enough to fit through the gate. He looked toward the palace as if he could see the room where decisions were written. His mouth tightened. His gaze returned to the arch. He reached for a cane and stopped himself. He looked at his hands and removed his gloves with a small impatience at his own formality. He slid them into his coat and placed his bare hand beneath the cane she had bent. How do I hold? He asked. Like this, she said, and moved his hand a finger's width. Outward to guide, not to force. He held as instructed. His hand was warm and steady. She tied, swift and sure. Their breath found the same pace without ceremony. He spoke low. I confronted Devereux in the chapel corridor. It was the wrong place for his kind of talk and the right place for mine. He said duty does not consent to appearances that can wound the crown. I said integrity is neither appearance nor wound. And he listened, she said, knowing the answer. He hears every word, the prince said. He makes an abacus of them and calls it wisdom. Then we must count differently, she said, and cut the twine. They worked in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that revealed rather than hid. When she needed a binding cloth, he held it ready. When he needed a second knot to be sure, she placed her finger to hold the first. The arch began to take the curve she had seen in her mind. It moved from imagination to structure, which is to say, from hope to evidence. A sound of deliberate steps sounded at the path's mouth. It was not Colette's goose or donkey cough. Colette turned the corner anyway, eyes urgent, and made the dying cough because sometimes you lied to give a little more life. Behind her, Madame de Montreuil came into view, every ribbon in place. She did not bother with preface. I have arranged a small lesson, she said, sweetness layered over iron. For the gardener. It will be instructive. We would not have anyone feel unprepared should she ever find herself near eyes. It would be cruel to let a person stumble. The prince's face went unreadable. He did not move from his place beside the cane. He did not remove his hand. He turned his head slightly, enough to acknowledge Madame, and not enough to cede anything. "What sort of lesson, Madame?" he asked. "The sort that prevents embarrassment," she said, for all concerned. "Follow me, child." Elodie did not wish to go. She did not wish to spend her last day learning how to vanish correctly. But refusing in front of the prince would turn a private punishment into a public affront. She glanced at him. He met her eyes without flinching. He stepped back from the cane, left it without his hand, and said quietly, "Finish the arch before sunset." Madame's eyebrow rose, a thin line of victory and irritation both. She led the way to a small retiring room off the side of a gallery. It had a long table set with too many forks and chairs that punished your back for daring to rest against them. A manservant stood ready to pour water as if water were wine. "We will correct posture," Montreuil said. "We will correct address. We will correct the instinct to answer a question at its first asking." "Ladies," she called, and the same two who had watched earlier drifted in like ghosts pleased with their haunting. Elodie stood in place and obeyed each instruction. She learned how far to bow to each rank she would never meet alone. She practiced holding her hand still at her waist so that people would not see the dirt line under her nails. She repeated phrases stripped of content. "Yes, madame. Certainly, madame, if it pleases you." She was shown how to stand behind a screen when tea was poured so that the slosh of liquid could be blamed on porcelain and not on a human hand. "You must never look anyone in the eyes unless commanded," Madame said. "When you speak, place your voice lower in your throat. It makes it seem smaller. Do not laugh. It encourages familiarity. Do not correct anyone. They will call it insolence, even if you are right. Especially if you are right." Elodie's jaw ached by the end of an hour, not from clenching, but from not speaking the truths that came to the edge of her tongue and sat there hot and useless. She finished each exercise without stumbling. She gave them nothing to name as failure. She folded herself down to the size they preferred and took the measure of the box. Then she stepped out of it. "Thank you, madame," she said at last. "I am taught. May I return to the roses?" "If you must," madame said, dismissing a fly instead of a human. "Do keep to the borders. There is talk, and no need to invite more." She glanced at the water jug. The manservant poured with the steadiness of a clock. Madame smiled as if she had orchestrated the pour with her mind. "That will be all." Elodie escaped back to air that moved. She walked fast, but not fast enough to call attention. Colette met her halfway and fell in beside her like a small soldier enlisted by emotion. "Did she hurt you?" Colette asked. "She hurt the shape of my breath," Elodie said. "It will return to me when I am under the sky." They reached the arch. The prince was waiting, not impatient, simply there. His gloves remained in his coat. He took his place without instructions. The cane softened under their combined will, as if it had never wished to stand straight in the first place. They tied and bound and stepped back to see. The curve was true. Monsieur Vauclair arrived then, awkward as a father at a dance. He held something behind his back as if it might bite him. When he drew it out, it was a pair of shears finer than the ones Elodie owned. The steel shone only where the edge must. The handles had been wrapped with a strip of blue cloth. "Take these," he said. "I had them before my hands began to argue with small movements. They belong with someone who can argue back and win. Finish your arch. If you must go, let your work remain." She took the shears. She did not try to thank him with words that would humiliate them both. She nodded once. He nodded back, embarrassed by his own kindness, and stepped aside to watch as if he were a boy again, learning from someone who had come by knowledge honestly. Distantly, a bell tolled the hour that was not yet sunset. The sound put a hinge in the day. People turned, changed direction, reset their tasks. The arch needed only the last tie. They made it. Elodie stepped back and wiped her palms on her skirt without noticing she did it. The arch stood like an answer to a question she had not dared to ask. "Well," said a voice that filled space with policy, "we create architecture now in our spare hours." Chancellor Devereux stood at the path's mouth, attended by two men in the household's livery. They were not soldiers. They were function. They had the manner of people who were used to moving chairs and people with equal detachment. Devereux's face held courtesy. His eyes held patience. His hands were empty. He did not need them to be full to be dangerous. "Highness," he said, bowing a fraction of a fraction, "the order stands. We would prefer to avoid spectacle. Let the girl pass quietly." The prince did not step away from the arch. He did not step away from Élodie. He placed his hand lightly against the cane nearest him, as if to say that disruption here would be to disrespect something that had not asked for their argument. His voice, when he spoke, was shaped for witnesses and truth both. "She remains," he said, "on my authority, under my protection. The gardens answer to me." A murmur rose from the small crowd that had gathered in the wake of Devereux's approach. A footman's mouth opened and then shut. A lady's fan stuttered and then went still. The two attendants exchanged a glance that had the outline of worry. Devereux's face did not change. He looked in every way like a man who had been offered a correction on a point of taste. He inclined his head to acknowledge the prince's words as if they had been polite and inconsequential. "Then the king will hear of this." The summons did not arrive like thunder. It arrived folded, sealed, and delivered by a boy who did not yet know how to keep his eyes from the floor. He placed it on the wooden bench where Élodie kept her tools and recited his line, as if copying it from the shape of the seal. "You are called to attend in the Hall of Mirrors," he said, "by request of the Chancellor, by knowledge of the prince." "Knowledge is not permission," Élodie said, and his ears turned pink as if the sentence were a warm hand. "I am only a mouth today," he murmured, and ran. She held the paper without breaking it. The wax was neat. The impression was clean. She did not open it because she did not need more words to understand. She looked to the arch. It stood with its curve complete, as if it had always intended to bend and had just been waiting for her hands to agree. She thought of walking straight to the servants' gate and letting the garden keep her secret. She thought of slipping away before the palace could shape her into its lesson. Then the lark sang, quick and bright, from the hedge behind her. 3 notes. A pause. 1 more. She laughed under her breath. The bird had no audience and performed anyway. She took off her apron, folded it, and set it beside the bench. She washed her hands in the basin Colette had filled and left with a sprig of mint floating on the water. She smoothed her hair with her damp fingers and walked. The corridors held their usual hum, not louder, not pretending ignorance. People looked and did not look. The hall opened ahead like a polished river. She had seen it only from the far end, where servants slipped in to set or remove a chair without being remembered. Today she entered by invitation. Her feet made almost no sound on the parquet. The mirrors caught her and offered her back 100 times, smaller each time, until she disappeared. There were men in powdered hair and velvet. There were ladies whose quiet was the loudest thing about them. There were ministers with their hands folded to hide how they wished to move them. Devereux stood near the center with a posture that suggested he had been born there and had merely grown taller. Prince Louis waited at one end, not on a throne, only on space. He saw her. He moved 1 step toward her, the smallest rebellion permitted in a room that measured everything. "You came," he said. "You asked," she said. "My refusal should be made in person." He blinked at that. Then a softness moved over his mouth. He offered his arm as one offers safety. She did not take it. She stood at his side, but not in his shadow. "Chancellor," the prince said, and the courtesy scraped like fine sand. "Let us finish the day's lesson." Devereux inclined his head as if accepting a cup. He gestured to a small table where a document lay like a modest culprit waiting its turn. Madame de Montreuil stood to one side, her hands looped softly at her waist, her face arranged into the expression that had always served her, composed concern. "The matter is simple," Devereux said. "A dismissal was issued to prevent misinterpretations. It has been resisted. In addition, a communication was received alleging a breach of confidence from the gardens to a rival estate. If true, it compounds the imprudence. If false, it is slander. Either way, it requires light." A breath moved through the room. It was not a sound, but a change in the air. Élodie did not speak. The prince did. "Who alleges?" he asked. "A letter," Devereux answered. "Signed, but not easily verified. It speaks of coin. It speaks of notes about grafting passed to a steward from Meudon. It speaks with correctness of structure, and none of the scent of truth. Montreuil's eyelids lowered in what she might have believed was a graceful show of patience. "In these times," she said softly, "even the appearance of impropriety corrodes. A lady at court brought the letter to me in confidence. I did not wish to trouble His Highness. I wished to spare him. But silence can be a disservice." "You have rarely been accused of that, madame," the prince said. His tone was even. His eyes were not. Vauclair stood at the edge of the assembly, hat in hand, fingers crushing the brim. His throat worked once, twice. Then he stepped forward to where he did not belong and looked as if he had found courage in a pocket he had not checked before. "I must speak," he said. His voice was too loud. He lowered it, and it was still a fraction too loud. "I have seen the paper. I know the watermark. It is an old stock used in the garden office for tallies. It has a hairline flaw in the lower right quadrant that looks like a reed by a river. It is not used by the rival estate. It is ours." The eyes in the room turned. Montreuil's calm did not break, but her hands left their perfect loop and pressed once against each other. "Perhaps the lady copied what she had seen," she said. Vauclair shook his head. He was red to the roots of his hair and beyond riches of embarrassment. "The ink tells," he said. "We mix ours with vinegar from the pantry when the bottle is low. It leaves a faint smell that fades. If you have a nose that lives where paper lives, you can smell it. I do. The letter was written here. The seal might be borrowed, but the ink is ours. It is a slap with our own hand." Devereux did not interrupt. He watched the confession like a physician watches a fever break. He reached for the letter and slid it from its cover with 2 fingers. He bent his head and brought the paper closer. He did not inhale in any obvious way. He did not need to. He turned it so the light struck the lower corner. The flaw in the paper showed itself as a ghost hair. He straightened. His voice did not rise or fall. It simply moved forward. "Thank you, Monsieur Vauclair. That will suffice for the letter. As to the dismissal, we may conclude it was issued to solve a problem that did not exist in any realm that matters to the welfare of the state. The matter of appearances is addressed by better conduct, not by exile." Montreuil's lips parted one fractional width. It was almost not visible. It was enough. Her gaze moved to Devereux with the helplessness of someone who discovers that the system she has oiled does not always turn for her. "Chancellor," she began. "Madame," he said gently, "your zeal has been tireless. It has not always been wise. The court requires guidance, not alarms. You will retire to your estate for a season in care of your health. It is the kindest reading of your mistake." The words landed softly and fixed like pins. No one cried out. No one had the practice for it. Montreuil stood very straight, as if bracing would set the moment back on its feet. Then she bent her head with the dignity of a woman who would not give them the spectacle of anything but grace. "As His Highness wishes," she said. It was not a concession to Devereux. It was an acknowledgement that the prince had chosen a side, and it was not hers. The prince looked at the gathered faces. Some were open, some had shutters. He did not attempt to persuade the shutters. He spoke for those who lived in light. "A crown is worn in rooms like this and in gardens where no one looks," he said. "If we teach the roses that honesty is an error, we will admire the leaves and find nothing when the season asks for bloom. The dismissal is void. The accusation is withdrawn. The garden remains under the care of those who keep it alive." Devereux nodded as if counting votes. It was not a vote. It was a decision. He raised the letter once as a token and then slid it back into its cover. A man from the household stepped forward to take it. Devereux handed it over without ceremony. He did not glance at Montreuil again. He had already moved to the next problem in the quiet room inside his head. "For form," he said, "the record will reflect that the dismissal was administrative and is reversed. No shame is attached. The servant may remain. The office of Madame de Montreuil will be assumed by her deputy for the term of her absence. Your Highness, do you wish to add to the record?" "No," the prince said. "I wish to add nothing to paper today, only to practice." The room waited to see if the waiting was over. It was. The assembly released itself in sequences like a well-executed dance. There were bows and murmurs, and the small relish with which people tell themselves that they would have decided the same way had they been asked. They would not have been asked. Vauclair reached Élodie with the stunned look of a man who has kept his soul, and is only now feeling the weight of what it cost him. He opened his mouth to apologize for everything he had been and had not been. She spared him. She put her hand lightly on his sleeve and said the one thing he could receive without shame. "Thank you." He swallowed. He bowed a little, more like a nod, to make it resemble equality. "You are owed better," he said. "I will not say more because I do not trust my mouth." He blinked hard, then fled to the safety of tools and lists. Colette materialized as if the parquet had given birth to her. She stood behind Elodie for 1 second, then pressed her forehead between Elodie's shoulder blades and whispered through linen. "I did not cough at the end," she said. "There was no cough for this." "There was no cough for today," Elodie said, and reached back to squeeze the girl's fingers where no one could see. "Go before someone decides you have an opinion." Colette scampered with the grace of a guilty angel. Devereux passed within a yard and gave Elodie a look that was not unkind and not an apology. It was a professional acknowledgement of a thing tidy enough to file. She did not accept or reject it. She let it pass. The hall emptied further. The heat of bodies lifted and left the room cooler, its mirrors less crowded, its chandeliers less burdened by breath. The prince stood beside her as if the room had receded and placed them in a simpler place. "Will you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They did not take the grand route. They moved through a corridor where the wax had been freshly rubbed into the boards. They stepped out to a square where the air had no memory of arguments. They crossed into the chapel garden that shared a border with the roses, separated only by a low stone wall. The arch was visible from there, a curve on the edge of their sight, like the rim of a promise. They stopped where a little bench faced a young tree trained against a wall. The leaves were small and careful with themselves. The sound of the palace softened to a whisper. The lark, faithful to its own clock, offered a short line of notes as if to bless or to amuse itself. He did not sit. He stood as if sitting would ask him to pretend informality. He looked at his hands. He took off his gloves not as a gesture for others to read, but because he wished to feel the air on his skin. He held them, then put them in his coat pocket, as if he had decided not to fetch them again. "I meant to protect you yesterday," he said. "It was the wrong verb. You do not require hiding. You require respect. I begin very late to understand so simple a thing." She did not help him with an easy sentence. He had no need for it. He needed the difficulty. "I intend to keep my work," she said. "I intend to keep my name. If I become a shadow, I will lose both, and I will become bitter. And bitterness is a disease that does not merely wilt the person who catches it, it poisons the soil." He nodded slowly, as if each inch were earned. "I will not ask you to be less in order to remain. I will ask you to be more if you can bear it. To be seen beside me, to make the garden and the court answer to the same truth. It will not be easy. It will not be quiet. Nothing that grows well is quiet," she said, and felt the nerves in her shoulders ease as if her bones had been waiting to hear her mouth say it. He took a breath that was almost unsteady. He steadied it and looked at her as one looks at the last question on a paper one knows how to answer, if only the courage to write remains. "I ask this not as a prince," he said. "I ask as a man who has learned, too late perhaps but not too late to act, what makes a life. Will you marry me, not in secret, not as a kindness, as a truth? Will you put your hands beside mine, and will you let me put mine beside yours where people can see, and call that equality by its name?" Her heart did not leap. It settled. It sat down in a chair that had been waiting for it. She felt her mother's old song move under her ribs, a rhythm that made sense of seasons. She did not think about the bells or the mirrors or the men who counted appearances. She thought about the arch and the way the cane had yielded when a firm hand asked it to bend and a careful voice told it why. "Yes," she said. He did not step forward as tales teach princes to do. He stood still, as if he had found the exact place his body had wanted to inhabit his whole life and had now been granted permission to remain. He lifted her hand. He did not kiss it. He held it, as if to show himself he could do it without pulling back. "Then we will do it properly," he said, with a small smile that had none of the old mischief and all of the new resolve. "We will do it so that when the courtiers tell the story, the facts will shame their ornaments into honesty." They sat on the bench then, because the formality had taken them as far as standing could go. They spoke of simple things that would require careful answers. Where would she live while the rooms were readied? How would the staff be told? What would become of the work if every conversation stopped it with compliments? She said she would keep her hours. He said he would adjust his to match some of them. They negotiated like people who had learned the value of soft stubbornness. A bell rang somewhere high and ritual. It was not urgent. It asked the hour to call itself by its proper name. He looked toward the sound and back to her face. "There will be conditions," he said. "There are always conditions with crowns. They will ask me to be discreet until they can teach themselves to admire what they do not yet understand. I will accept what does not break us. I will refuse what bends us into lies. I will accept the weather as it comes," she said. "I will not accept a roof that leaks and ruins the seed. There is a difference." He raised her hand slightly, as if to agree without words. His ring glinted. It would glint on her finger soon. The thought did not make her dizzy. It made her patient. Footsteps approached on the gravel, quick but not rushed. Devereux appeared at the corner of the wall with the look of a man carrying a basket of facts he had decided were ripe. He stopped at a respectful distance and blinked at the sight of their hands joined openly. He took in the arrangement with the neat satisfaction of someone who appreciated order, even when he had not authored it. "Your Highness," he said. "Mademoiselle, the record is complete. The dismissal is void. The letter is recorded as false. Madame de Montreuil has agreed to the Chancellor's suggestion, with gratitude for the chance to recover her strength. There will be murmurs. They will find the stone of your words inconvenient. They will trip over it and learn to walk." "Thank you, Chancellor," the prince said. He was formal because habit is a coat you do not throw away even when you change your shirt. Devereux's eyes flicked to their hands again. He did not smile. He permitted the corner of his mouth to consider it. It did not commit. He bowed. "I will be frank, Highness. This will require navigation. You will have mine if you will tolerate candor." "Candor is all I will tolerate," the prince said. "Then allow me the first piece of it," Devereux said. "The king will permit a small ceremony quickly. He will require discretion for a season. He will call it prudence. I advise we accept the portion of prudence that protects you from the foolish and refuse the portion that would pretend the fact is not a fact. It is a stupid dance to step as if music were playing when it is not." Elodie almost laughed. She hid it because the man had not meant to make her smile. She liked him a little for that. "Then let us choreograph our own steps," the prince said. Devereux inclined his head. "I will send word to the chapel. The arch will be a kindness to our arrangements." He said the last with the faintest acknowledgement of poetry, and then it vanished. He withdrew as neatly as he had arrived. They were alone again in the quiet, without being hidden. The lark tried another line of song, not for them, perhaps, but for the way the air was easy to breathe. The leaves shifted. The small tree traced a shadow like lace on the wall. He spoke first, not because he needed the last word, but because he had one truth left that wanted saying. "When I met you," he said, "I thought I was interested in your hands. It was a way to make sense of what had unsettled me. Today I admit the truth. It is your courage that undoes me and puts me back together. It makes me equal to my own name." She looked at him and felt how far past fear she had walked, without knowing when the distance had lengthened behind her. A person could live a day like this only a handful of times in a life and feel it for years. "Then let us be equal in all the ways that matter," she said. "Let us keep the roses honest and the people who walk among them too. Let us be very bored by lies." He laughed then. It was not loud. It was clear. It made her think of the first slice of clean wood at a true angle. He stood and she stood. They did not bow. They did not add a gesture they did not need. They turned toward the path together. The arch waited where the chapel garden met the roses. Colette had scattered a few petals under it because she was incapable of passing an opportunity to improve an image. Vauclair had straightened the twine where it had slipped, his fingers telling his eyes a new story about loyalty. The path was clean. The light was late and kind. He looked at the arch and then at her. She nodded. Yes. He took her hand again and did not drop it when someone turned the corner and saw. They walked beneath the curve that had been hope yesterday and was work today. It felt like a vow even before the priest heard a word. And the hour which had arrived with a summons left with a promise. The day of the wedding came as quietly as dew. It had been agreed upon with as much ceremony as a storm needs to move an ocean. None and all. The king did not appear. his seal did. That was enough for those who needed such things. The rest of them needed only air and witnesses who believed what they saw. Elodie rose before the light and washed in the basin where Colette had tucked 3 fresh mint leaves, as if to make the water remember the garden. She wore her cleanest dress. It was plain and honest. Colette fussed at the seams with fingers that wanted to invent lace and settled for smoothing every line. When she stepped back, her eyes went bright, and then quickly practical. "You will need a ribbon," Colette said. "Not for show, for memory." She produced a strip of blue cloth and tied it around Elodie's wrist with a knot that would hold under a storm and give under a gentle pull. It matched the cloth around the handles of the shears Vauclair had given. Elodie touched the ribbon and said thank you in a tone that meant the word for more than the ribbon. Colette nodded once as if accepting a commission and wiped at the corner of her eye with the heel of her hand like a child refusing a nap. Outside, the chapel garden was freshly swept. Early light made the stone wall warm to the eye even before the sun had caught it. The arch stood at the boundary where the roses began, green with the promise of the weeks ahead. A few buds had dared a first show of petal. They were small and brave. Vauclair had trimmed a stray end of twine and then stepped back far enough to be nothing more than a satisfied ghost in the corner of the scene. Prince Louis waited without attendants pressing him into a silhouette. He had removed his gloves before anyone could remind him. He held them, then tucked them into his coat and left them there, as if the pocket were a kind of drawer where certain habits could be stored. He stood beneath the arch and did not step forward until he saw Elodie's foot touch the path. "You are early," he said. "The roses wake early," she answered. "So must we," he said. The priest who met them was the chapel's man of ordinary hours, not a great prelate sent to make the moment heavier than it needed to be. He had the kind of hands that had poured soup as often as holy water. He did not lengthen the rite. He did not starve it. He asked each question once, and they answered with words that were simple and were everything. "Do you come of your own will?" he asked. "I do," Elodie said, and felt the earth agree. "I do," said Louis, and his voice did not search for more air than he needed. "Do you promise constancy in health and in sickness, in ease and in difficulty, in honor and in the daily weather of human love?" "I promise," they said together, and the lark gave a small impertinent line of song that made the priest smile and pause as if heaven had inserted a phrase. The ring was simple gold. It had belonged to a woman whose name Elodie did not know, and who had worn it with a life so modest that only the metal remembered. Louis slid it onto her finger slowly, as if he wished to learn every texture of the moment. Her hand did not tremble. When she lifted her hand to place a ring on his, the light caught on the band like a nod. They did not kiss, as in tales that have more audience than truth. They bowed their heads together and stood like that for a heartbeat that felt like a held breath between 2 lines of a song. When they raised their faces, the chapel bells gave a gentle peal, not loud, not a declaration to the town, only to the garden. Witnesses made the moment a life. Colette stepped forward with a basket she had filled by raiding corners of other baskets, petitioning the other girls, and stealing rose petals from buds that would not miss them. She scattered the petals like a child and a queen both, arm wide, then clapped a hand over her mouth in sudden embarrassment at her own joy. Vauclair looked down at his shoes and pretended to adjust the buckle so the wet in his eyes could be for leather. Devereux appeared at the edge of the path, as if he had been placed there by a drawer that slid open at the right moment. He bowed precisely. When he straightened, he looked not at the prince but at Elodie, and made a small inclination of respect that might have been overlooked if one were not trained to watch for such changes. "The record shall reflect," he said, "that a union took place this morning in the chapel garden, witnessed by the household under seal. Let it reflect also," Louis said, "that the union was chosen by the people in it." "I will add the words," Devereux replied, and for once the hint of a smile escaped his discipline. News did not explode. It moved along the palace the way sunlight tracks a wall, slow and inevitable. Servants learned first, as always. Then the ladies and the gentlemen shaped it with their tools. They told it in whispers and with shrugging envy. Some decorated it with worry, some with satisfaction. All of them watched. Watching was a currency. The instructions from the king followed at their own pace. Discretion, he required, as a man requires a smaller fire in a summer kitchen. No parading, no provocations. Let the court find its breath. It was a concession that felt like a test. The prince accepted the portion that protected. He gently refused the portion that would have made the truth a secret. He did not hide in corridors. He did not seek an audience he did not need. He lived steady as a clock that tells the right time whether anyone hears it or not. Elodie kept her work. It was the only way she knew to live. The day after the wedding, she rose with the grey and tied back her hair with the same ribbon. She walked into the beds with her shears and her old basket, and the ring that made her hand feel new. She pruned, she watered, she loosened soil around roots that preferred air to suffocation. She taught a young apprentice how to judge the angle of a bud eye without squinting. She showed Vauclair a new way to stake a cane, so the wind would argue less in the night. She answered the questions of a marquise who came to learn what she thought was botany, and left with a better understanding of patience. Not everyone approved. Approval is a plant that grows as it pleases, not as we order it. Madame de Montreuil's absence left a vacuum into which drifted new versions of the same old primness. A cousin to someone of consequence attempted a slight in the long gallery, remarking within Elodie's earshot that soil must be kept outdoors lest it stain the marble. Elodie answered without heat. Marble returns dust to itself, she said. It is only honest work that keeps it shining. The cousin blinked and smiled faintly, as one smiles at a clever dog, and walked on. Elodie did not pursue. She did not become sharper than she needed to be. She had seen how sharpness cuts its owner's hand first. Louis learned new habits. He tried the weight of meetings that had been performed for him by men whose lips never tired. He interrupted gently. He asked questions as if pruning dead explanations might allow a living solution to grow. He refused to sign a paper written to comfort nerves rather than to help lives. He returned between tasks to the garden as if it could teach him how to lean and not to bend. They met at dawn and sometimes at noon, and once or twice in a twilight that painted the gravel with long shadows and made them imagine years as a kind of evening, cool and merciful. They spoke in the language that work teaches, small exact words that carry heavy things without wobbling. Then, when the day allowed breath, they spoke of the future like sensible thieves, stealing bits of peace and hiding them in places where danger could not find them. "You will be pressed," she said one afternoon, trimming a side shoot that had become greedy. "They will try to put me behind a screen and tell you it is chivalry. Then you will stand in front of the screen," he said, "and I will stand beside you and we will look stupid enough to make the screen feel silly." She laughed at that, quick and warm. He did not look to see if anyone approved of the sound. A season stretched. The buds fattened and learned to trust the light. The court, reluctant pupil, learned to be bored by its own outrages and to be interested in the things that lasted. A young duchess asked Elodie, on a morning full of honest birds, how to instruct her groundsman to cut without cowardice. "Courage," Elodie said, "is learned by doing a small brave thing and realizing you did not die. I suggest a single bold cut and a step back to watch the plant forgive you." The duchess repeated the sentence later to 3 friends and claimed it for her own. It did not matter. Truth outlives the name on its first tongue. The day of public acknowledgement came without blaring trumpets. It arrived because the set of decisions had accumulated into a shape that could not be denied. It was a promenade day, the kind where the court moved as if it had been poured onto the gravel and left to settle. The sky was polished pewter. The air smelled of damp stone and the rind of something citrus from a bowl near the orangery. 1,000 eyes made a light wind. The arch wore its first real flare of bloom. The north beds, once a tangle, now held lines with the confidence of a practiced hand. Louis stood at the head of the path. The king's seal had gone ahead in a note, a scant line of acceptance, signed and cold, and yet sufficient. The assembly arranged itself in a crescent, for that is how people stand when they mean to be kind to their own curiosity. Servants hovered at the edges like commas, necessary and overlooked. Devereux placed himself in a position that allowed him to hear every cough and every compliment. Vauclair tucked his hands behind his back to prevent them from ringing. Elodie came from the roses without a flourish. She did not come as a surprise. She came as something that had been happening for many months in plain sight. She wore the same plain dress with a clean apron over it, because truth does not require silks to be seen. Her ring caught light and passed it along. No music announced her. The lark, out of charity or mischief, offered a quick ribbon of sound and then was satisfied with its own wit. Louis looked at her and then at the people. He did not raise his voice as if he must shout against a storm. He spoke in a tone meant for witnesses, not for walls. "I present to you my wife," he said. "She keeps what we walk upon alive. She tells me when I am wrong with a voice that makes me grateful to be corrected. She has taught me that consistency is a virtue, and that fireworks belong to festivals and not to vows." A small laugh moved through the company, the kind laughter that makes a space safer. Elodie stood beside him. She did not bow to the murmurs. She did not search for friendly faces. She watched the roses a moment, and then lifted her gaze to the people as if they were plants in need of light. "We cut what must be cut," she said softly. And somehow the softness reached the farthest ear. "Not to wound, but to make room. We tie what must be tied so it does not break when the wind asks its question. We water enough and not too much. That is how a garden lives. That is how people might." The words were not polished enough to become a tract. They were accurate enough to become memory. Someone clapped, a footman who had not remembered he was invisible. The sound startled him, and he froze. Then a kitchen maid, Colette, who had come with a tray she did not intend to deliver, lifted her hand and struck it to her palm as a human being and not as a position. The sound multiplied. It moved from the servant's edge across the noble crescent in hesitant flutters that grew into wings. People applauded before they decided whether or not to do it. The body is sometimes more honest than the mind. Louis did something very small then, and it mattered more than any speech he might have made. He lifted his right hand and, in front of everyone, removed his glove. He did it without the shape of defiance. He did it as if removing a glove were a natural thing to do when one wished to feel a hand. He extended his bare hand to Elodie. She did not hesitate. She placed her hand in his, and he did not hold too tightly. He held as if a person were not a thing to be possessed, but a life to be accompanied. Silence followed the applause, a good silence that rests on a space that has been cleared for it. In that quiet the garden made its own sound, bees a wing, the small crackle of gravel under a single adjusting foot. The moment was what it was. It did not ask permission to exist. It asked only to be noticed and then to be allowed to do its work. Work continued. It was not less noble for following goodness. If anything, it was more. Elodie taught a class of noble children, pulled in by mothers who understood that virtue can be disguised as an activity, how to plant beans against a stick and watch them climb. She demonstrated the right way to hold shears. She told them that plants lied sometimes, and that one must look for the truth under the green. They listened with the urgent intelligence of those not yet soaked in pride. One boy cut wrongly on purpose, and then laughed with delight when she did not scold, but asked him what he had learned and how he would make it right. He learned. He made it right. Louis began to bring matters of state into the garden, not as theatre but as medicine. He received a report while leaning against the low wall and asked the minister to walk as he spoke. Something about the open air made the minister abandon 2 ornaments in his sentences and reveal the heart of the problem. The solution grew from that honesty the way a rose grows after a hard cut. No one credited the air. No one needed to. It worked. The seasons turned, as they do whether we are ready or not. Summer pressed its palm to the backs of their necks. Autumn arrived with its pile of gold. Winter stood at a distance and promised not to be cruel if respected. The arch kept its promise. It flowered and rested and flowered again. Elodie walked beneath it with Louis at dusk, when the day was tired and kind. They touched the cane once in a while, as if to check the heartbeat of their own effort. They argued sometimes. Love requires it if it wishes to be honest. Their arguments were not storms meant to tear down houses. They were brisk winds that knocked down dead twigs. When he forgot to tell a counsellor no, because he had been taught always to say yes to rank, she reminded him with a phrase that made them both laugh in the end. When she took on too much work and came home with a back that felt older than her years, he told her she would serve the garden better by assigning tasks to the hands eager to earn her trust. She listened. He listened. They cut. They tied. They watered. They made room. Colette grew into her courage like a shoe that had waited for the foot to match it. She took charge of a small plot behind the kitchens and produced herbs that made the soup sing. When the head cook took credit, she shrugged like a general who knows a battle is won and does not require a trumpet. Vauclair aged into a gentleness that he had not known how to wear when his pride was newer. He showed new apprentices the plan wall and told them that the best plans change when the plants tell you they must. Devereux continued to file facts into the world's drawers and to remove them when they no longer fit. Once he found Elodie counting seedlings and asked with a rare curiosity that made him younger whether she preferred rouse to wild scatter. She answered, "It depends on the seed," and he nodded as if she had spoken a theorem. One evening in late spring, when the light decided to linger and the air held the warmth as if reluctant to give it back, Louis and Elodie walked the long path hand in hand without noticing they did it. The court noticed. It did not erupt. It accommodated. Habits had shifted under the surface, and the shape of the surface had changed without breaking. The young looked on as if it were natural. The old looked on as if a comfortable chair had been moved 1 foot to the left, and they found the new angle kinder to their backs. They stopped beneath the arch. It had begun as her last act before exile. It had become the first act of a different reign inside the same walls. The cane above them whispered because the breeze had found a way through the leaves and could not resist telling them something. They did not need to hear the words. They understood the sense. He turned to her. He did not look for an audience. He did not lean toward the mirrors where other people admired themselves. He looked at the person who had taught him a better way to stand in his own life. "Thank you for not returning the glove to the wrong hand," he said. "Thank you for taking it off in front of them," she said. They smiled, the way people smile when there is nothing to perform and everything to feel. He lifted her hand to his lips and did not kiss it with an actor's flourish. He kissed it as if it were a sentence he had promised to say every day until he had no more days to say anything else. The lark, obliging, sent up a single bright note that seemed to agree that promises are best kept in small, steady ways. Elodie looked along the beds. The roses had begun to open in earnest. The first flush was always generous, then thoughtful, then generous again. She felt the same in herself, energies and rests, efforts and quiets. Beside her, Louis watched with a patience that had become muscle memory. He did not need to be taught the difference between waiting and neglect anymore. He knew it in his bones. People spoke of them, of course. People always do. Some of it was poetry dressed as gossip. Some of it was gossip dressed as poetry. None of it added to or subtracted from the thing itself. The truth was, walking under the arch every day, a pair of hands that had learned to carry devotion and duty without dropping either. The kingdom did not split for it. It bent like a cane guided by a good hand and found a shape that could bear weight and flower. When the first child came, the garden did not pause to acknowledge it, and that felt right. Life had never paused for anyone. It had only continued with them or without them. The nurses moved softly. The bells did not toll, and the roses smelled as they had always smelled. He was swaddled in cloth that had not touched that sort of softness before, and held beneath the arch for a breath. He did not cry. He yawned as if inaugurated into a long and necessary work. Later, when he learned to walk, he would hold on to the low wall and insist on being allowed to fall safely. His mother would let him. His father would learn to look and not reach too quickly. Courage again, taught to small legs. Years passed but did not seem to move away. They layered themselves. The arch grew thicker with wood that had begun as questions. They added a second arch along another path, not as a duplication, but as an answer to a different light. They planted a row of herbs for Colette and a line of trees that would outlive all of them. They practiced a faith that did not require incense. It required consistency. It rewarded it with shade and with scent. People sometimes asked Elodie, bravely or foolishly, if she had ever been afraid. She answered honestly, "Yes, every day at first, less later. Now I am only afraid of wasting a season. Fear is useful when it is small enough to fit in a pocket. When it grows, I cut it back." And love, they asked when they were bold enough. "Love is patience with hands," she said. "It is a knife that cuts to make room. It is water the day before a drought. It is looking at the same face every morning and recognizing the person who helped you become yourself. It is simple. It is work. It is the easiest thing when you are brave and the hardest when you are not. We practice." The court included the sentence in its own language. Practice became fashionable as a verb. For a decade, no one mocked it. Then, when fashion moved on, practice remained where it had begun, in the hands that kept making, kept tending. One late evening, as old summer turned toward early autumn, and a long table had been set in the garden for the people who actually kept the palace alive, gardeners, cooks, stable boys who were now men, laundresses with carved strong wrists, Elodie stood and lifted a cup of water, not wine. The moon had come up pale and curious. The arch was dark with leaves, lit by small lanterns that Colette had insisted upon with the stubborn joy of someone who finally had permission to be a little foolish. To honest work, she said, to honest love, to the courage it takes to keep both. They drank, they laughed, they told stories that would be embellished tomorrow for people who had not done their share that day. Louis, beside her, squeezed her hand under the table, where no one needed to see to feel reassured about the world. When the lanterns were doused, the night went softer rather than darker. They walked one last time beneath the arch. The air smelled of cut grass and the last bit of heat the day had given to the stones. He stopped her with a gentle tug. She turned. He looked at her as if he had discovered something worth keeping, and was surprised daily to find it still there. "We were right to be stubborn," he said. "We were right to be patient," she answered. "We were lucky," he said. "We were brave," she corrected, and then smiled, because the two truths lived well in the same sentence. They stood a moment more. No trumpets, no speeches, only the quiet knowledge that the world can be taught to bloom if two people decide to tend it with their hands and their courage. He lifted her hand. She lifted his, their fingers interlaced, as if to remind one another that constancy is not a posture but a practice. The lark woke earlier than either of them the next morning and tried a note. The roses, satisfied, kept their counsel and their beauty. The palace at last understood that its grandeur had found a gardener, and that the gardener had found a prince who could learn, and the future, which cares only for truth, held them both, steady and seen, and let love go on growing. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.